Okay, well, here we go. So this presentation is kind of a combination of my lived experience, and also I did a little bit of research just so that I would have, some authority behind what I said. Okay, so as Tia said, I'm going to talk about sort of the prevalence of anxiety and depression among international learners. We'll go into quite a bit of detail about what anxiety is and various points about anxiety, and quite a lot of detail about depression. Then towards the end, I'll talk about sort of starting the discussion with students and what it means for us to provide some support, and then resources and referrals. Okay, Tia gave an introduction, I guess, but to who I am. I guess the one thing that I would add is that I think sort of a pivotal moment in my ESL career was when the Kosovar refugees came in 1999. And at that point, I had extensive training in dealing with students who had experienced trauma. And as I was working with them with the Kosovars on the Trenton base and later the base in Kingston, I really saw some of the things that we had talked about in action, as planes were flying into Trenton and they were all running, the Kosovars were all running for shelter because, of course, planes meant bombing. And so, it's real, that I think was one of those pivotal moments in my career that really opened my eyes to sort of mental health and our students. Okay, so as I said, I did some reading, and I do have a reference list at the end. So this, the literature review by this, in this article by Sumar et al. Gave a couple of these articles. Whoops, we've gone backwards. Oops, okay. Where has it gone? There we go. Okay, so in the literature review, one of the first articles that they referred to was an oldie, but nonetheless, it's sort of the starting point, I think. And so considering the cultural differences and misunderstandings of the new and diverse experiences, it is likely that international students will experience feelings of estrangement, anxiety, and depression as part of their adjustment process. And I just thought that was, a really interesting starting point. It is likely that international students will experience these things. And so then, building on therefore, it is crucial to increase awareness about international students' problems and to recognize the students' individual perspectives regarding the factors that are involved in the adjustment and adaptation process. And so we'll talk some more about increasing awareness. I think we need to increase our own awareness, but also in students' awareness of the kinds of difficulties that they may encounter. And so then Sumer's study noted that factors that impact the prevalence of anxiety and depression among international learners include the degree of social support, age, and level of English proficiency. Some other factors that they looked into, like gender and so on, didn't seem to play as big a role. Okay, so then, just starting right at the basic level, what is anxiety? Anxiety is an emotion characterized by feelings of tension, worried thoughts, and physical changes, likely increased blood pressure. People with anxiety disorders usually have recurring intrusive thoughts or concerns. They may avoid certain situations out of worry. And then Mayo Clinic adds experiencing occasional anxiety is a normal part of life. However, people with anxiety disorders frequently have intense, excessive, and persistent worry and fear about everyday situations. Often, anxiety disorders involve repeated episodes of sudden feelings of intense anxiety and fear or terror that reach a peak within minutes. And so, you know, I guess we have to recognize that there is this distinction between sort of everyday anxiety and anxiety disorders. And I'm not necessarily going to make that distinction or dwell on that distinction here, but we do want to be aware of that. And perhaps sometimes with these things, it's helpful to think of them almost like a scale, you know, with sort of occasional run-of-the-mill anxiety, can I say that, on one end of the scale, and then anxiety disorders, you know, on the other end of the scale, something like that. Some anxiety signs and symptoms. I'll give you a moment maybe to read that over, and then I'll highlight a couple. So what I would say is that a lot of these signs and symptoms would be known to the individual who's experiencing the anxiety. You know, from the outside, it might be difficult for us to know that a person is having a sense of impending doom, danger, panic, or panic. But the person within themselves would know that. I have put in bold 3 signs and symptoms that I feel like I bump into as an ESL instructor or as a manager quite often. I might find students who have trouble concentrating or thinking about anything other than the present worry. And I might not know what it is that they're worrying about, but it might be quite clear to me that a student is having trouble concentrating. Again, it might be quite clear to me that a student is having trouble sleeping if they seem very tired in class, if they're yawning, if they, you know, putting their head down on the desk, that sort of thing. Or they might even mention that they're having real trouble sleeping. Another one, experiencing gastrointestinal problems. Well, you know, I sometimes have had, and I hate to you know, categorize this way, but it seems to me that in my experience, I've had young Asian males who would frequently go darting from my classroom, kind of clutching their bellies. And that's a very different kind of experience than the ones who slink out the back door because they need a cigarette. So I always felt badly for those students because it was pretty clear to me that there was something, you know, pretty stressful going on in their lives, or something that was putting them in a really bad spot that was making it difficult for them to, say, complete tests or assignments in my class. So then anxiety, you know, specifically in the ESL classroom. So, you know, there were some articles that dealt with that very specifically. So, for example, they highlighted performance anxiety. So, for example, test anxiety, or anxiety about speaking, or anxiety about reading aloud, those sorts of things. And those things may vary from student to student, but some students may find, you know, reading aloud stressful, but they don't mind just speaking freely. Or some students really don't like a particular kind of test, but they're okay with another kind of test. Another factor is a fear of failure, and I think, you know, that's a big one, particularly in certain cultures where maybe a high performance is demanded. And also, I think that can be an individual trait for students who tend to be maybe a little bit perfectionistic. And then this article highlighted a relationship between culture and anxiety. And they did give the example of Asian culture. Of course, the authors themselves are Asian, and which, you know, Asian culture being a test culture, a high performance culture, and that students from that kind of culture may experience more anxiety. Again, as I've already alluded, individual personality traits. Some students will just self-identify as being more anxious than others. And then, of course, you know, at the risk of stating the obvious, anxiety impedes a performance. It becomes very difficult to think clearly when you're anxious. And so then, you know, the tests that you're anxious about, well, lo and behold, you won't maybe do so well on that test. And so it'll be kind of self-fulfilling, your anxiety. And then, you know, we get into this vicious circle where anxiety impedes performance. And so then your performance isn't as good. So then you become more anxious and so on. And so that's not a great thing for students. And another sort of anxiety, though, that I didn't bump into as I was doing some reading. Now, I will admit, I didn't do a huge study, but nothing really popped up, you know, as obvious. And that was anxiety about external factors. And in my experience, that's a very real thing for our students. We see them in this context in Canada, you know, studying at Trent or wherever, and we kind of forget that they have this whole other life, and they have friends and family at home. You know, I find very often I have students in my office who will fess up that, you know, their grandparent has died or their grandparent is very ill. And so then maybe they were up all night, you know, because they were, you know, communicating with their grandparent in a suitable time for the grandparents' time zone, which isn't necessarily a suitable time for the student in this time zone. You know, students may worry about the political situation, especially if their families are in a war-torn kind of situation or their country is in upheaval. Students may worry about their health or their parents' health or their grandparents' health. And students may worry about current events. So for example, students may be worrying about COVID-19. They may be worrying about COVID-19 as it impacts their families. Students may be worrying about racial tensions. You know, I know a few years ago when there was a lot of, you know, world events happening around persecution of Muslim people, you know, bombings in Paris and so on, that became a big issue for our students. And at that time, of course, we had the fire at the mosque here in Peterborough. And so that can create anxiety for students. So some strategies for mitigating anxiety or lessening it. So, you know, overall, there would be two strategies. And one would be to give students coping strategies, and then the other would be to alter the learning environment, to make the learning environment a little easier or more palatable for students. So in terms of giving the students coping strategies, we can do things like explain that making errors is part of the learning process and it doesn't reflect badly on the student. And we can maybe help students to do some reframing. So reframe anxiety-producing situations as something to fight or something to conquer, something that we can get past. Or even reframing ESL classes as self-determination. In other words, instead of feeling like I'm a victim in this ESL class and I have no control over this, and my teachers are out to get me, and I'm going to fail, but that the student themselves has the ability to control to quite an extent what happens by studying, by participating, by going to class every day, by making other opportunities to immerse themselves in the English language, and so on. So this again can be something that we can do to help students deal with their own anxiety. And then of course, encouraging regular attendance and participation. For one thing, that helps students to have something to do other than stewing on their anxiety, but also by attending regularly and participating, then hopefully the learning process starts to go well, and that too will mitigate the anxiety. Then in terms of classroom strategies, and I'm sorry I'm sort of coming at this from a teaching perspective, but I think probably you can transfer these to say an itch setting or another setting. So we want to create a welcoming community, including considering what the physical environment is like. We don't want to be in some dingy, dark, damp basement. We want to be in a bright, light, welcoming place. And we want for students to feel welcome. We want to ensure that a student's basic safety needs are met. Thinking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs and that bottom level where we need to feel safe. We want to ensure that students feel safe when they are in class. Maybe enjoy, avoid competition. I mean, we have to take this with a grain of salt. Playing a game can be fun, but we don't want to have unhealthy competition. We want to encourage mutual support, and so cheer for everybody. Now this one it was a bit kind of funny, but I get it. Avoid stress-inducing, unnatural classroom activities. So for example, some error correction strategies. The difficulty is that what is unnatural is determined by cultural experiences. And so if your cultural experience has been that you've gone into school in one setting, then you're going to have expectations about what natural classroom activities are. But if you've gone to school in another setting, then you may have very different ideas about what natural classroom activities are. So it may take some investigating on the part of the instructor or the facilitator or whatever to find out, okay, what kinds of classroom activities have you experienced in the past? I guess one thing that I have often done when I sense that students are maybe not quite on board with what I'm doing is to explain why I'm doing what I'm doing. Just be very explicit about it. And, we might think it's obvious why we're doing what we're doing, but once we unpack it and we explain that this is why we're doing what we're doing, usually students are pretty quick to get on board, and then that may become less stressful for them once they understand what it is we're doing. Another option is provide students with choices where possible. Of course, it's not always possible, but with an assignment, you can do it live, or you can do a recording or something like that, or, in an itch setting, okay, people who are interested in board games can do the games over here, and people who are interested in talking, can have a conversation or a discussion over here. So just giving students choice and that sense of self-determination, I think, is important. And then another thing is pitching activities appropriately. In other words, being mindful that we don't want them to be so difficult that that in itself becomes anxiety producing. And then thinking back to my days with refugees, avoid content that might be stress inducing and trigger memories, so you don't necessarily want to remind students about bombings or other things if it can be avoided, especially if they come from war-torn countries or they are refugees and they've experienced really difficult things in their lives. Okay, well, with that little overview of anxiety and being mindful of time, I'll just keep on going and I'll go with depression. So again, APA defines depression as more than just sadness. So APA being the American Psychological Association. People with depression may experience a lack of interest and pleasure in daily activities. They may experience significant weight loss or gain, insomnia or excessive sleeping, lack of energy, and inability to concentrate, feelings of worthlessness or excessive guilt or recurrent thoughts of death or suicide. Depression is the most common mental disorder. Fortunately, depression is treatable. A combination of therapy and antidepressant medication can help ensure recovery. And then by the Mayo Clinic, depression is a mood disorder that causes a persistent feeling of sadness and loss of interest. Notice that loss of interest phrase. Also called major depressive order or clinical depression, it affects how you feel, think, and behave, and can lead to a variety of emotional and physical problems. You may have trouble doing normal day-to-day activities, and sometimes you may feel as if life isn't worth living. And so here, depression is being viewed in a very clinical sense. But again, I think there's that sense of maybe the scale where, there may be some short-term depression or depression as related to a particular situation or season in life, or there may be those who experience long-term chronic depression. Okay, and so then depression signs and symptoms, again, lots there. I'll give you a moment maybe to read that slide and then I'll focus on it a little bit. Okay, so again, I've highlighted some phrases that that stand out to me. Loss of interest. I think that that's a key one. Students who stop coming to class, students who stop coming to it who previously did come. Sleep disturbances again, but in this case, it could be insomnia or sleeping too much. Tiredness and a lack of energy. So even small tasks take extra effort. So students who find that they just don't have the energy to put into their homework or to their assignments. Trouble thinking, concentrating, making decisions, and remembering things. Again, there's that concentration thing that we saw with anxiety as well. So depression among international learners. A couple of articles highlighted that. One talked about self-critical perfectionism, and indeed, international learners, they may well be students who have performed at very high levels in their home countries, And they may be used to getting very high marks and performing very well, and then they get into this new setting where maybe their English isn't as good as others, or maybe they have other learning challenges just because they're in a new culture, and so they're not performing as well. This can lead to depression. An article noted that less individualistic cultures experience less depression than individualistic cultures. Acculturative stress, so in other words, getting used to a new culture was strongly associated with depression, and lack of social support is strongly associated with depression, which I think points to the work that ITCH is doing and other sort of social settings for international students as being very important. So strategies for mitigating depression. These are things that students can do. They can seek the right kind of social support without an overemphasis on talking about problems. So like on one hand, you know, we want students to have friends or people that they can talk to, but at the same time, it's not necessarily helpful for them to talk again and again and again and again about their problems. Exercise can be a cost-effective treatment for depression. You know, going out for a run, going to the gym, all of those things can be really important for students. And then, of course, getting professional help. And I'll talk about that a little bit in a moment. Another piece of advice is for students to be patient with themselves and others. That may be going back to that self-critical perfectionism business, you know, accepting that they may not get the same kinds of marks that they were used to in their home country. Being patient with others, you know, being patient with professors and others that they're dealing with. And then valuing self-care over self-criticism. And then strategies for institutions. One suggestion is literally to begin interventions pre-arrival. You know, so to be creating social connections and social networks for students even before they arrive. And to even be helping students to understand that moving to a new culture is tough. And you may find that you are depressed at some stage. You know, to just help students understand the process of moving to a new culture and the process of becoming acclimatized. Another thing that institutions need to do is to reduce the stigmatization of receiving counseling services. We need to, in a sense, normalize this. We need to be able to provide bilingual or international counselors for students. We need to teach stress management techniques. We need to support social networks. So in this day and age, you know, whether that's online groups and forums, or whether that's in-person groups, we need to encourage students to build social networks and to take part in social networks. And we need to recognize that social support is key, not only for depression, but also for anxiety. Okay, so starting the discussion. So we've talked about a little bit about what depression is, what anxiety is, some things that you might see. You might see students who are tired. You might see students who are maybe not focusing well, those sorts of things. So now what? What do we do? So I think one thing that we can do is to normalize talking about emotions a little bit. And I know that at Trent ESOL, that's something that we've really worked on. And yeah, and so here are some things that we've done and some things that the literature suggests. So you can start each class or each session with a quick check-in. There are various ways of doing that. You can, have pictures of emojis, and which emoji can you relate to? Do you relate to the smiley one? Do you relate to the one chewing the fingernails? What emoji? Where are you at today? You can show photos or play music that maybe conveys emotions and can you relate to the person in this photo, or can you relate to this song? You can talk about news headlines for sure. These days, how are you feeling about this COVID headline in your country, or how are you feeling about the fire at the mosque? How are you managing these things? Or how many people feel, if it's a particular time in the term, it's just before or after reading week, it's almost the end of the term. How many people are feeling tired today because you've been up late studying? How many people are feeling a bit stressed because you've got lots of tests coming up? Just to and then they realize, oh, I'm not the only one who's feeling this way. Everybody's in the same boat as me. And that it's even coming from the teacher. Oh, it's okay to feel this way. The teacher almost expects me to feel this way. Not that we want to create it, but that there's a sense that this is normal. And another thing that we can do is we can find a moment alone with a student. You don't have to be, in a separate room, but you can, how it is. You can find a little quiet corner in the room, and you can say, I notice you're tired today. Are you okay? Or I notice you're quiet today. You're not as talkative as sometimes. Or I notice you're having trouble concentrating today. Are you okay? Just make the observation and then open up that possibility for the student to respond. Another thing that we can do is that we can be very proactive. And so in our lessons, in our workshops, in our sessions, in our whatever we're hosting, we can educate students about the acculturation process. We can educate them about seasonal affective disorder, and that you might feel a little blue in February, and that's okay. We can educate students about depression or anxiety, or about the helps that are out there. We can read articles about these things, or listen to interviews about other students' experiences. And whether or not we think anybody is experiencing these things, we can introduce these as topics, and then lo and behold, you might find that someone actually is experiencing whatever you're reading about. I know that when we have sort of, can I say, a normal orientation at Trent, this year's will not be normal. On the first day, when I do a bunch of games with the whole incoming group of students, we might have 65 or 85 or 100 students, and I'll do some get to know you games. And the last one that I always do is the very last. In that group, I have people stationed around the room, and I ask them different questions. Oh, who comes from a large city? If you're a large city, you go to this group, or a small city, you go to this person, and so on. And then the very last question, so they run to the corner of the room where they belong, and we have various questions. And then my last question is always, so I'll have one person in one corner of the room, I feel happy. One person in another corner of the room, I feel excited. Another person in another corner of the room, I feel tired. Another person in another corner of the room, I feel a little nervous, or a little stressed, or a little afraid, something like that. And okay, run to your corner of the room where you belong, And there will always be a few who are in that a little afraid group, you know, and then that's great because you can take a few moments and you can, you know, try to reassure them or provide them with some support or whatever. So we can create these opportunities where we can find out where students are at. Okay, so then what is our role? And so our role, so this comes from an article. This was really an article about dealing with refugees, but nonetheless, I thought that this section was quite helpful. It was the role of the ESL teacher, but it could be the role of a facilitator, you know. Really, you know, the role of someone who is working with international students or ESL students. We want to be a good listener and a keen observer of students. Okay, we want to listen to what they hear, what they say. If they say every day, I am so tired, well then, you know, we want to remember that, okay, and then maybe have a little quiet word. I notice you say that you're tired all the time. What's that about? And a keen observer, or I see you're tired every day. Let's talk about that, you know. We want to be a mediator between cultures, and this is between the students' culture and our culture, and helping them to unpack those differences and what they're about, and why is Canadian culture the way it is, and why do Canadians behave the way that we do. We want to be a provider of information about resources. Oh, these are places that you can go that can be helpful to you about, you know, natural things, you know, libraries and cheap clothing and all kinds of stuff, but also about mental health supports. We want to be a facilitator who enables students to problem solve, okay, and gives them the tools so that they can problem solve. And we want to be teachers who help students to learn new skills that build confidence. But we do not want to be the problem solver or the burden carrier. We want to tread that line very carefully because we don't want to put ourselves into a position where we become fatigued and where we are carrying more than we should be. But instead, we want to be a mediator or a facilitator or a teacher to enable students to problem solve for themselves or to find resources for themselves that will be useful to them. And then resources and referrals, and this is, I'm coming down the home stretch now. So these are some places where we can point students. So I would really emphasize GuardMe Insurance. We don't use GuardMe at Trent, but when I'm at conferences and so on, GuardMe they're just tremendous. And they have videos and webinars on their website that are just available. They're very generous, and so I logged onto their website just to double check that today that they still had videos and webinars and so on up on their website, and they do on various topics like, you know, how to handle disappointment and things like that. They had some for students, and they had some for you know, for teachers and providers and so on. Good to Talk is a free that provides free counseling services for Ontario post-secondary students. It's a 1-800 number. Of course, there's the 4-County Crisis Center, Kawartha Sexual Assault Center. At Trent University, of course, there are the counseling services. There's Trent students have access to what's called the I Am Well app, an integrated mental health and wellness app. And I would really highlight that because triage is available in some astronomical number of languages. I think it's something like 130 languages. And counseling is available in not quite so many languages, but quite a good number of languages. Another thing available through Trent for Trent students is therapy assistance online. And I gather that that has a number of articles, and so you have to log in with your student number, but there's a lot of resources there. And so I went onto the Fleming site. They mentioned Good to Talk, 4 County, and Kawartha as well. And then they do have personal wellness counseling there. So that is that in terms of resources and referrals. So I guess I would just say that this is not something that we have to take on ourselves, but we can be referring students to experts who can support students and provide them with the professional support that they need, if that's what they need. And then I have a reference list if you are interested. A couple of articles on anxiety. This one here, a guide for teachers working with refugees. It's maybe a little, maybe not quite this topic, but nonetheless, it's very helpful, I think, for working with students who may have experienced trauma or other things. And then here's this article about self-critical perfectionism and so on. And then predictors of depression and anxiety, and how does anxiety influence language performance. That was just a smattering of articles. I found all of them, honestly, online. They're all publicly available. And so if you do want to Google, you can find resources.